I broke up with my girlfriend because she wanted to stay a virgin. Now she wants to come back and confesses something painful. At 23 years old, I felt like my life was just taking off, and yet I carried a knot in my chest that I didn't know how to name. I met my ex, who was 21 at the time, when we were both living in different dorms on campus, and the chemistry was instant, the kind that makes you cross half the campus just to share coffee. We became a couple within a few months, and except for one detail that kept growing larger in my head, we enjoyed a warm relationship, full of care and routines that made us feel like we belonged to something. I came from a teenagehood where romance hadn't gone my way, and it felt incredible that finally someone chose me. Without realizing it, that silent gratitude slowly turned into complacency. She had grown up in a deeply religious household, with a pastor father and a set of values clear as a list taped to the fridge door. Even though she told me she no longer shared her family's faith, I could see in her eyes that part of that upbringing still lived on, like a voice that never shuts off. From the start, she was straightforward. She was a virgin and wanted to remain one until marriage. It wasn't a doctrine she had chosen from conviction, but more of a promise tangled up with not wanting to disappoint her dad. I listened respectfully, and at the beginning, I thought I could navigate that shore without either of us getting hurt. Our intimacy found other paths, caresses, long kisses, closeness that carefully avoided crossing a certain line. I was a virgin too, though I had never worn it as a badge nor carried it as a burden. It just hadn't happened yet. The problem wasn't the label itself, but the absence of shared consent to take the next step. She had her limits set, and I tried not to pressure her because I wanted to be a good boyfriend, someone trustworthy, someone who never forced anything. Over time, that patience blended with a silent resentment that I was ashamed of. As college years went by, and I saw my friends experiencing sexual relationships without much drama, I struggled to understand why we couldn't. I didn't want a rushed wedding just to validate an intimate decision. Marriage felt far away, almost like a project for adults we weren't yet. I was still juggling semesters, temp jobs, and tight finances, while she, on the other hand, was already talking about her first professional job. That opened another crack, one I hadn't anticipated. She graduated before me, landed a job at a fancy office, and started mingling with people who sounded important. She told me about brilliant colleagues, big projects, and salaries that only reminded me how thin my student wallet was. It wasn't her fault, but it made me feel small. Added to the intimate barrier between us, I began to think we wanted different things and weren't walking the same street anymore. We argued several times, not by yelling, but with that sharp edge of disappointment that cuts deeper than any insult. I tried to explain that it wasn't about a whim, but about the need to feel fulfilled together, to share that part of our relationship too. She would reply that she wasn't ready, that her promise to her father still weighed heavily, that she didn't want to betray herself. I insisted I wasn't trying to force her. I was just trying not to betray myself. The tension grew like moisture inside a wall. You don't notice it at first, but when it appears, the plaster is already damaged. In the end, I made the decision that broke me. I ended things. I felt like we were staying together out of habit, holding on to something that would eventually charge us interest in the years to come. She cried a lot, and I hated myself for being the cause of her pain. There were no public scenes, no shouting on the street. Just two young people learning that sometimes love isn't enough if life projects don't align. I left with my stomach twisted and the sad conviction that it was the right thing. Almost 6 months passed without us talking. I threw myself 100% into finishing my degree and surviving the last round of exams. I didn't go out with anyone. I didn't have flings. I didn't enjoy that post-breakup freedom that others compare to summer rain. I just wanted to close out my college years without tripping up. Missing her came and went like a tide that sometimes rises until it's stuck in your throat. When I finally turned in my last report and saw my name on the graduation list, I felt an odd lightness, like I had finally dropped an old backpack. I started preparing for my first professional job, something that both excited and scared me. It was during that transition that she reappeared. A short message, an invitation to talk, a promise that she only wanted to clear the air and see how I was doing. I hesitated. We had too much history to ignore and too many fresh wounds to open the door carelessly. Still, I agreed to meet. She arrived with that mix of shyness and determination I knew so well. She told me she had missed me like a bone-deep ache, that she had thought about us, that maybe she wanted to give it another try. And for the first time, she added something she had never said before. She was willing to have sex with me. I asked what had changed. Discomfort crossed her face like a shadow, looking for somewhere to hide. After a clumsy detour, she confessed that while we were apart, she'd had a brief relationship with a co-worker, an older man she had gone out with for a while. She didn't owe me an explanation. I know. She wasn't my partner anymore. Even so, hearing that with him, she crossed the line she had kept closed with me broke something inside me that's hard to put into words. She was clear that everything had been consensual, although at first she felt his persistence as a steady push. I wasn't thinking about judging her morally. I was thinking about my own years of waiting, holding on to an expectation that mattered to me. In my head, an unfair question took root. Why him and not me? There wasn't an answer that brought relief, but the splinter stayed irritating. Remember, if you enjoy these stories, subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell. I asked for time. I didn't want to decide from impulse or wounded pride. She nodded, maybe understanding that this late truth came with invisible consequences. I went back home and walked without direction, tried to put a name to what I felt. There was nostalgia, there was affection, there was anger, there was grief for a future I had imagined and didn't get. In the middle of that jumble, there was also an uncomfortable idea. Maybe, just maybe, I had always known we didn't fit on that essential point. The following hours were a silent conversation with myself. On one hand, everything seemed to line up for a reunion. We loved each other, we had history. Now there was openness in the intimate sphere. On the other hand, the timeline hurt, the order of events, the way the boundaries shifted when I was no longer in the picture. I didn't want to go back out of inertia or fear of being alone. If I went back, it had to be a clean choice, not nostalgia dressed up as clarity. I slept badly. At dawn, one idea felt solid. My feelings matter just as much as hers. If I had lived for years within someone else's boundary, now I had to stand by mine, not going back to a place where resentment could sprout again. I didn't want to build on a crack I already knew. I texted her to ask for space, and she respected it for a few days. I read advice on forums, talked with a couple of friends, and wrote down thoughts in my journal, like I've done since I was 16. Many told me, move on, make a clean cut. A few said, give a shot. Between those extremes, my compass swung back and forth. I wasn't looking for anyone to decide for me, but hearing different voices helped me discover corners I was overlooking. Some comments insisted my problem was an obsession with virginity, when really the issue had always been the lack of shared intimacy. If she had wanted abstinence without the symbolic component of being a virgin, the conflict would have been the same. I wanted a full relationship, and she didn't. The title we give a story can confuse the point. The core was compatibility, not the label. As I turned pages of my notebook, I realized the most honest thing would have been to end it from the beginning, back when her decision was clear and I, without saying it, was silently hoping she'd change with time. I stayed for love, for illusions, and for fear of hurting her. I learned that prolonging the inevitable only multiplies the pain when it finally breaks. It was a bitter lesson, but necessary so I wouldn't repeat it. I also recognized my wounded ego. It hurt to know that with the next guy, yes, that I was the one who waited while someone else had the first time. Logically, I knew she owed me nothing, that it was her body and her decision. Emotionally, the sting was real. I chose not to deny that feeling nor let it run the show. Accepting it let me look it in the eye until it lost strength. By then, I'd convinced myself of something practical. Blocking contact could be self-care, not malice. If the temptation to talk came back, that barrier would remind me of my decision. And if she decided to ignore our no-contact agreement, it would still be easier for me to keep my distance. It was time to take the wheel of my own life. In the following days, I focused on breathing better, tidying my room, taking aimless walks down familiar streets. A long weekend came, and I went camping with friends in the Grampians. Nature clears my head like few things do. The silence among the eucalyptus trees puts my thoughts in order. Sitting by the fire, I told him the puzzle of to get back together or not, and got a chorus of opinions. A friend asked me something that cut to the bone. If she hadn't reached out, would you have called her? The answer came out on its own. No. That clarity rattled me, as if I had been waiting for that question to accept it. I realized I had been too passive, more attentive to what someone else wanted than to what I needed. I understood that deciding isn't reacting. It's choosing your own path. Back home, I had already decided not to go back. It was liberating and, at the same time, sad. I wasn't going to erase what we lived or demonize her. Simply, our shared path had run its course. I deserved a relationship aligned with my desires, just as she deserved someone who walked her same map. That acceptance lowered my anxiety, like opening a window in a closed room. When I got phone signal again, her messages came in a cascade. She said she had been wrong to ask me back, that she was with Tim again, fake name, and that it was more serious than she'd let on. She also apologized for sugarcoating the story. The hit felt strange, a mix of relief, annoyance, and confirmation. I replied only no when she asked to meet. It wasn't the time to hear new versions. That night, out of idle curiosity, I looked up Tim online. I found him quickly. A director at his firm, traveling, photos in exotic places, a car that costs as much as several student lives. There were pictures of them in Singapore. I didn't need more details. I closed the tab, aware that comparing myself wouldn't do me any good. I wasn't competing with anyone. I was choosing peace. A few days later, my doorbell rang. It was her. She said she knew I didn't want to talk, but needed to straighten out the knot she'd made. I hesitated. In the end, I agreed to listen with one condition. If I decided this would be the last time, then it would be. She walked in with tense shoulders and a voice trembling with anticipation. What followed was a long, dense conversation where we tried to extract truth from a tangle. She told me that after the breakup, she spent months crushed. Then she met Tim at work. He wasn't her direct boss, but he had charisma and obvious interest. They went out, liked each other, and over time she decided to sleep with him. It wasn't a quick slip. It was the culmination of a relationship that was growing. When she had said before that he was persistent, she had tried to cushion the blow for me. The full version was that she was the one who took the step with conviction. I told her I'd been worried, I misunderstood, and thought she'd been pressured. She shook her head firmly. It was her choice. And while lying to protect my feelings had been a mistake, I could also see that her intention hadn't been to hurt me, but to spare me a pain that came anyway. Listening without interrupting let me recognize the complexity. No one is the villain of their own story, and yet harm exists. She explained that the arrive of virgin to marriage promise was born more from pleasing her father than from an adult conviction. After we broke up, she looked in the mirror and decided that this childhood vow wouldn't rule her life anymore. So when her connection with Tim took shape, she chose to live her sexuality freely. In that map, I wasn't there, and that was part of the grief I had to accept. Then I asked why she'd wanted to come back to me. She told me about a poisonous comment at the office. A coworker insinuated she was just another one of Tim's girls. She investigated and learned he had a record of dating younger women at work. The rumor hit her hard. They fought, broke up, and, nudged by nostalgia, she thought that with me, she could recover a safer kind of love. The time I took to reply showed her she was forcing a return out of fear, not certainty. The following weekend, Tim asked to patch things up. She agreed to try, and, off camping with no signal, later received that sequence of contradictory messages. We said goodbye politely and agreed to keep our distance. She wanted to be respectful to her relationship, and I needed to close the door so I wouldn't stay half in, half out again. It was a farewell without heroics, just two people admitting they no longer choose each other. In the days after, we went on with our lives. I temporarily moved in with my brother while I organized my finances and looked for a rental closer to work. He had just broken up with his ex, and we kept each other company in that odd in-between stage. He found a new housemate, and I, because of commute issues, moved into a shared house in southeast Melbourne. The place was modest, but the neighborhood had a good pulse. I landed my first job as a graduate engineer. The jump from theory to the field filled me with nerves and excitement. For the first time in years, money was enough. I could treat someone to dinner without doing surgical math. I could breathe without my negative balance trailing me like a shadow. The job challenged me, pushed me, put me alongside very capable people. There were exhausting days, and even then, I smiled on my way home. At one of those welcome barbecues, I met Olivia, the sister of one of my housemates. We talked as if the rest of the patio had gone quiet, and the night dissolved into laughter and small conspiracies. I asked her out, and everything flowed with a natural ease that surprised me. Weeks later, we decided to be exclusive. She was smart, funny, beautiful, and the chemistry felt like it had been waiting for us all along. With Olivia, I learned something else. Intimacy, when it's shared with calm and care, doesn't feel like a goalpost, but like an honest conversation between bodies. My story with I had left its mark, but it didn't define me. It was another station on a route, not the terminal. A month later, one of Olivia's co-workers hosted a party. I went to meet her circle. There were 40 or 50 people, new faces, laughs that were strangers and soon felt familiar. I headed to the kitchen for drinks, and a guy asked me for a beer from the fridge. "I'm Tim," he said, with that uncommon name I already knew. We shook hands. He had no idea who I was. I said nothing. I went back to the group with my heart pounding in my throat. Later I confirmed with the host, Jess, that she had worked with Tim at the same firm where I also works. Melbourne is big, but these professional circles make the world small. On the tram back, Olivia noticed my silence. I told her the broad strokes and the connection. She was surprised by a detail. I had never told her I was a virgin when I started dating I. She laughed tenderly and joked that chapter was already closed between us. There was no drama, just a memory stirred up by coincidence. I told myself there was nothing to resolve, that each of us was walking our own path. Still, I had trouble sleeping that night. Not out of jealousy, but because of the echo of a story I thought was buried. It reminded me that the past doesn't disappear. You either integrate it or it chases you. I preferred the first option. Weeks later, we went to a formal charity dinner for Olivia's work. We sat with her colleagues, kind people making polite conversation that jumped from football to their latest accounting project. When someone congratulated me because Olivia wouldn't stop talking about me, I felt a warm flush in my chest, the quiet joy of being loved without conditions or impossible requirements. After dinner, I felt a pat on my shoulder. I turned, and there was I, standing next to Tim. It was strange to see her again, made up with an elegance I didn't remember, a red dress that highlighted a new thinness, jewelry that hinted at luxury. She looked like another version of herself, more polished, farther from the pastor's daughter I held in my memory. She congratulated us both, showed off a sparkling ring, and announced their engagement. I responded politely and introduced Olivia. My smile seemed to stall for a second. There were no snide remarks, no scene. Just that brief silence that says too much. I wished them well and said goodbye. Olivia, her arm on my back, held the moment with a serenity that grounded me. On the way home, she said, "I think you still matter to her a little." I took a deep breath and answered that. Even if that were true, it didn't change what mattered. My life was here, not there. Days later, my brother texted me. I'd stopped by my old address asking for me. He, faithful to our pact of offering no info, said nothing. Soon after, I received an email from an unknown account. It was her. She said she was happy to have seen me, that she missed talking with me, that she thought Olivia was pretty, that she hoped I could attend her wedding next year. She didn't mention the no-contact agreement, nor the visit to my brother. The email annoyed me for its lightness, for the way it tried to invite me back into orbits that no longer belonged to me. I showed it to Olivia. With her sharp read on people, she asked me to think about why I would send me something like that. She can't have you back, and she's engaged. What does she really need? She asked. I didn't have a definitive answer, but I suspected she was looking for emotional support or validation for decisions that weighed on her in silence. I didn't want to play at interpreting her life. I deleted the email and blocked the address. I also set up a filter. Any message with her name would head straight to the trash. There was no hate in that gesture, just self-care. I had promised no contact too, and I wanted to honor my word, even if the other side couldn't. Sometimes taking care of yourself means learning to close doors respectfully. I talked to Olivia afterward. I asked if this whole mess made her uncomfortable. She said no, that she didn't sense anything shady and that she trusted me. I felt relief. You don't often find someone who, instead of feeding insecurities, gives you firm ground to walk on. My life found its rhythm. Demanding work, pub afternoons with my housemates, Sunday markets, and TV series. Olivia and I learned our routines. Who makes the coffee? Who remembers the keys? Who picks the movie? Shared normalcy became a luxury. Sometimes I found myself marveling at how simple calm can be when you're not bracing against an invisible wall. I still wrote in my journal. Putting my feelings into words is how I avoid becoming a passive spectator of my own life. Since I was 16, those pages have been my most honest mirror. Between the lines, I saw my story with eyes shrinking, not because I forgot, but because other things grew around it. When life expands, old hurts find their place without taking up all the space. I asked myself whether I'd learned the original lesson, not staying where my boundaries dissolve just to please someone else. The answer was yes, but not as a rigid rule, more like a daily practice. Choosing means saying yes and no in healthy proportions. With Olivia, yes and no were negotiated without guilt. That was new for me and deeply healing. I also revisited the idea of a first time. I used to treat it like a dull trophy or an unpaid debt. Now I saw it for what it was, a conversation with the right person at the right time from shared freedom. That defused the thorn of comparing my path to I's. We were parallel stories that no longer intersected. At work, I started joining projects that demanded more judgment and less timidity. Feeling, finally, like I was up to the task changed my posture toward the world. It wasn't arrogance, it was relief. When you can pay rent without a circus act, sleep 8 hours, and still take your partner to dinner, your heart settles into a different rhythm. One afternoon, while we were walking by the Yarra, Olivia told me she admired the way I closed chapters. I didn't know what to say. I didn't feel particularly skilled. I was just tired of dragging half-closed doors. She smiled and squeezed my hand. "That's exactly the skill," she said. I laughed. Letting go has bad PR because it sounds like loss, but it's also a way to make room. People messaged me on Reddit about the original story. Some defended abstinence as a pillar. Others criticized it harshly. Over time, I understood the point wasn't who's right in the abstract, but whether two people can uphold an agreement without one person erasing themselves. I couldn't. Admitting that saved me from growing in the wrong shape. I thought about I's father, the pastor, and how kids inherit other people's maps and then have to redraw them to scale. Maybe, in the end, she was simply doing that work, reconfiguring her compass. That doesn't make her a villain. It doesn't make me a martyr either. We were two people who tried and got the timing wrong. Jess wrote to invite me to another get-together, this one smaller. I went with Olivia and we had a good time. No unexpected encounters. I was grateful for that steady normalcy. At some point, life asks you to change genres, from romantic tragedy to slice-of-life comedy. And it's a relief when you can follow that script without feeling like you're betraying something. Back home, I opened my email and saw an empty spam folder. I laughed to myself. Sometimes mental health is as unglamorous as a well-configured filter. Months later, I got an invitation to a gala where Olivia's employer was a sponsor. I put on a suit that finally fit me without borrowing it. At the table, toast blended with talk of vacations and promotions. Having lived with a student's austerity, I looked at that world with curiosity and felt like a welcomed visitor. In the hallway, I glimpsed him and I chatting with a group. It was just a flash. I felt nothing but the right distance. I caught myself genuinely wishing they'd find a healthy way to be. Not because I needed them to validate my choices, but because I've learned that someone else's peace can also clear your horizon. When we stepped outside for air, Olivia rested her head on my shoulder. "Wild how different it is from a year ago." "Huh," she said. I nodded. A year ago, I measured my worth by resumes and rules I hadn't chosen. Now, I measure my life by my own decisions. You can't see that change in photos, but it straightens your back. We laughed about silly things while looking for a taxi. The city looked like a bright postcard from the curb. I thought about how love grows in the everyday, not in catastrophes. Opening the door, remembering an allergy, asking how it really went. I don't know the exact moment I became contemporary with myself, but there I was. Before bed, I wrote one line in my journal, "Don't go back where the lesson's already been learned." It didn't sound heroic, it sounded useful. Some phrases are valuable for the trouble they spare you. One random Saturday, Olivia and I did a deep clean of the house. In the moving boxes, I found old notebooks with exam drafts, wrinkled receipts, and the movie ticket from our first date. I caught myself smiling at it. Olivia appeared in the doorway and asked what I'd found. I told her the story of that day, and we ended up recreating it with takeout. In the middle of that mini celebration, my phone rang with an unknown number. I didn't answer. I had already decided curiosity wouldn't get more privileges than my peace. If it was important, they'd leave a message. No message came. I closed the loop with a simple gesture. I silenced the phone and went back to the movie. That night, I dreamed of campus, the dorms, and a clock that wouldn't move. When I woke up, I felt a soft kind of melancholy, the kind that doesn't hurt. I made coffee and stood quietly by the window. You never fully shed your old versions. You stack them like the rings of a tree. The trick is letting the new sap keep rising. Olivia hugged me from behind and asked if I wanted to go for a walk. I said yes. We talked about nothing and everything. Halfway through the park, she stopped and said, "Thanks for choosing me without ghosts." I didn't know how to explain what that line did to me. I could only squeeze her hand. Choosing someone is also choosing a way of being. In the afternoon, I read some old notes where I scolded myself for being too meticulous. I laughed. Maybe I am. But now I write for me, not to impress anyone. That's another luxury of adult life I'm just getting used to. More Reddit messages came in. Curious people wanted to know how it ended. I said just enough. That I'm okay. That I learned that life goes on. Some insisted I would break our no-contact deal and reach out again. I thought it was unlikely, but stories have their own sense of humor. Weeks later, my brother let me know she had swung by his building again. She didn't say much, just asked if I was still in town. He repeated that he couldn't share my address. I thanked him for his loyalty. The next day, another email from a new account. It was I. She said she was glad to have seen me at the gala, that she missed talking, that Olivia was lovely, that maybe I could attend her wedding. It read like a half-whispered monologue. I deleted and blocked again. I didn't reply. I left no room for misunderstandings. I understood that sometimes people look to exes as a mirror when the present confuses them. I wasn't that mirror anymore. I had my own glass to clean, my own reflection to hold up without seeking external approvals. Olivia and I talked again. I wanted to make sure this wasn't opening cracks between us. With a generous calm, she hugged me and said she trusted what we were building, that echoes from the past wouldn't dictate our language. I had never felt such concrete peace. I created an extra email rule. Any variation of her name, Ege, even Ag or Letty, would go straight to the trash. I did it with an ironic smile. Sometimes self-care is technical. Filters, lists, deliberate silences. On a Friday night, we went to a cheap concert at a corner bar. The band had more enthusiasm than precision, and that was perfect. We danced clumsily and laughed at our shadows. Back home, Olivia said I seemed different, lighter, more tuned into what I wanted. I was surprised that someone could notice a shade. I was only just sensing. Love, when it's healthy, returns to you versions of yourself you thought you'd lost. The following Monday, I was assigned a challenging project at work. For the first time, I had to lead a small part of the team. My hands trembled in the first meeting, but we walked out with a clear plan. Midweek, one of the seniors told me, "You're doing well." I tucked that compliment away the way you save a ticket from a special concert. That night, I pulled out my journal and wrote about choices. I remember my friend's question by the fire. Would you have called her? That no kept lighting the way. Sometimes a single clean answer is worth more than 100 justifications. It's a pocket lighthouse you pull out when the fog returns. I thought about Tim, about how certain figures act more like symbols than people. To me, he represented everything I felt I wasn't: success, age, solvency, worldliness. Today, he's barely a footnote in an old anecdote. It's liberating when symbols lose power and people regain their real size. I told Olivia I was proud of learning to choose calmly. She replied with a joke about how she'd chosen me too, and we toasted with tea because we were out of wine. Happiness is sometimes a warm mug at an irresponsible hour. 5 months went by since I's last email. Life, when you don't tangle it up, tends to move forward on its own. I started saving for a small trip. Olivia wanted to show me a couple of spots she loves outside the city. At the office, days passed without me checking the time every 5 minutes. That's a good sign. It means you're busy in the right way. One afternoon, Olivia and I crossed the CBD talking about impossible recipes. On a corner, I saw Jess from a distance and we waved. She told me in passing that she was changing jobs again. We laughed at the joke that Melbourne has 5 million people, but only 3 offices everyone passes through. It was a quick, warm exchange. I liked noticing that I no longer linked her face with any in or not. That night, out of discipline, I opened the journal and wrote a short chapter. I said, the story ended without applause or booze. It ended, period. Sometimes that's the healthiest thing, a finale that doesn't need grand gestures to be definitive. Epic is exhausting. Sobriety holds you up. Olivia asked if I'd ever go to that wedding I'd been invited to. I smiled. Who goes to an ex's wedding? I answered, and we laughed. There wasn't a trace of bitterness in that laugh. It was simply absurd to picture myself there, an extra in a movie I no longer work on. We toasted to well-done endings, and to beginnings that don't need permission. Winter arrived with scarves and soups. I surprised myself wanting to learn one of my mom's recipes and calling her so she could guide me over video. She celebrated that I finally cared about something beyond sandwiches and pasta. I promised to cook for her when I got it right. Family has its own clock, one that sometimes sinks when you least expect it. On a slow afternoon, I looked back at the first notebooks where I still wrote about I with anger and sadness. I underlined a sentence. Trusting my gut is the biggest lesson. I held on to that. Intuition isn't magic. It's distilled experience. When I listen to it, I don't need as many detours. Olivia came home with market flowers and a big smile. She told me a ridiculous work story, the kind that becomes an inside joke. I realized our relationship had filled up with those microlanguages only 2 people understand. Those codes are small bricks that hold entire houses. That night, I dreamed I was walking across campus again, but this time the clock moved. I woke up certain that the past was finally walking by my side without tugging at my sleeve. It's a light feeling, like the air changed density. Before bed, I wrote one more line. Not every closed door is a loss. Many are salvation. I slept through the night. At work, my quarterly review was positive. They gave me more responsibility and an internal course. I thought about the guy who used to measure his life against someone else's Instagram and gave my past self a symbolic pat on the shoulder. We all have a Tim we run against. Progress is stopping the race we never signed up for. Olivia organized a dinner with her friends. Between laughs, someone asked about the ex story. I answered with the barest version, no details that would reopen locked cabinets. I calmly noticed I could tell it without sweaty palms. The anecdote had become that, an anecdote, not a ghost. After midnight, we walked home. Olivia hooked her arm in mine and said she liked this present, plain and simple. Me too. Quiet love doesn't need constant tests. It renews itself through small actions. Turning off the phone, listening without crafting your reply, washing the dishes without being asked. I told her I wanted to protect that, with discipline. On my way to the shower, I thought that a year ago I wouldn't have believed this stillness. Lives don't change through violent twists, but by patient insistence. Repeating a good habit, choosing one more time, resisting the urge to dramatize. This is how you straighten your course. In bed, Olivia rested her forehead against mine and said, "Thanks for being here." I told her I didn't have a better place to be, and I meant it. As spring neared, my brother invited me to a barbecue. Over beers, I came up casually. Someone said they'd seen her at a downtown cafe with a floral folder and wedding catalogs. I felt nothing special, just the sensation of looking at an old photo from a trip you won't repeat. I was surprised that my body didn't tense up. That too is closure. Later, my brother thanked me for the time we shared rent and looked after each other. I hugged him. It's curious how some pains create good bonds by ricochet. If I hadn't ended that relationship, maybe I wouldn't have lived with him or learned our routines as adult brothers. Back home, Olivia was asleep on the couch with a book open on her chest. I watched her for a while with that gentle affection that doesn't need announcements. I slipped the book away, tucked the blanket around her, and turned off the light. Sometimes happiness is so simple you feel shy naming it. On the edge of the bed, I wrote 3 words, I am home. They weren't geographic. They were state of mind. After so many turns, I finally recognized myself in the mirror without asking anyone for permission. I fell asleep thinking about my May graduation, my parents proud on a video call, the soup I promised to make again. The future didn't scare me anymore. It waved me over. Monday kicked off my new responsibility at work. There were hiccups, of course, but nothing that clear communication and humility couldn't fix. At the end of the day, I walked to the river and watched the water. I thought about how life sometimes asks for basic things. Say no when it's no, say yes when you truly feel it, and steady yourself while the surf calms down. I checked my phone. No unknown numbers, no emails resurrecting debt agreements. I smiled, not because I needed proof I was over it, but because silence is also a kind of music. Some chapters sound better when they end with a fade-out rather than a final crash. I went home with cheap flowers for Olivia and a budget bottle of wine. We cooked something simple, toasted to nothing in particular, and laughed at a silly joke. It struck me that exactly this, was what I wanted when I asked myself what a full relationship should feel like. Not big fireworks, but a steady fire that warms you every day. In my journal, I wrote one last note about this story. She's my past. I chose my present. No resentment, no debt, just decisions made in daylight. If anyone ever asks me what to do in a similar case, I'll share what I learned. Protect your boundaries, honor the other person's, and if they don't fit, let go with respect. I turned off the light with a quiet certainty. I don't know what lies ahead, but I'm no longer afraid to build it paragraph by paragraph, with the same patience I used to close this chapter. Remember, if you enjoy these stories, subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell.